She said it 3 times. Each time, her voice trembled just enough to betray the truth. She didn't want him to stop. Dan Morrison watched the woman next door turn away, her hands shaking as she closed the door between them. 6 years. That's how much older Grace Holland was, and somehow the world had convinced her it mattered. He could see it in the way she avoided his eyes when he brought over burnt cookies, in the way she smiled at his daughter, but stepped back when he came too close. The neighborhood whispered. His 8-year-old asked questions he didn't know how to answer. And Grace, beautiful, broken Grace, kept building walls he desperately wanted to tear down. So Dan made a decision. What he did next, in front of everyone who ever doubted them, would change everything. The morning air in Maple Street smelled like cut grass and the last traces of summer rain. Dan Morrison knelt in his driveway, wrench in hand, the old Chevy bleeding oil onto cardboard he'd spread beneath the engine. His knuckles were already dark with grease, and the sun hadn't fully cleared the roofline of the houses across the street. He liked these early hours before the neighborhood woke up, when it was just him and the sound of metal on metal and the occasional bird calling from Mrs. Hayes's oak tree. Across the low fence that divided their properties, Grace Holland's kitchen light was on. She was always up early, even on weekends. Dan had learned her rhythms over the past 8 months, the way you learn the patterns of someone you can't stop noticing. Coffee first, always in that blue ceramic mug. Then out to the garden with her gloves, and that old straw hat that had seen better days. Sometimes she'd look toward his driveway, and their eyes would meet for half a second before she turned away. The screen door of his house banged open, and Sophie appeared in her pajamas, hair sticking up in wild directions. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes, but everything else was his. The stubborn chin, the freckles across her nose, the way she approached the world like it owed her answers. "Can I go see Miss Grace?" she asked, already halfway down the porch steps. "It's early, kiddo. Maybe wait until—" But Sophie was already running across the grass in bare feet, vaulting the fence with practiced ease. She landed in Grace's flower bed, and Dan winced, waiting for the rebuke. Instead, he heard Grace's laugh, warm and surprised, drifting across the morning air. "Sophie Morrison, you're going to crush my petunias." "I'll be careful. Can I help you plant?" Dan stood, wiping his hands on a rag that only spread the grease around. He watched his daughter crouch beside Grace, small hands mimicking the woman's steady movements. The early sun caught the silver threads in Grace's dark hair, and something in Dan's chest tightened the way it always did when he looked at her. 8 months. That's how long Grace had been living next door, and Dan had been in love with her for at least 6 of them. Maybe longer. Maybe since that first Tuesday in March, when Sophie had come home from school with a fever, and Grace had appeared at their door with soup and children's medicine, and stayed until the worst had passed. He could still remember that night with perfect clarity. Sophie, burning up on the couch. Dan pacing the floor with his phone in hand, trying to decide if this was emergency room bad or just waited out bad. Then the knock on the door, and Grace standing there in jeans and an old sweater, holding a thermos. "I saw your lights on late," she'd said. "Is Sophie all right?" She'd stayed for 4 hours, sat with Sophie while Dan ran to the all-night pharmacy, showed him how to do the lukewarm bath to bring down the fever, her hands gentle and sure. Around midnight, when Sophie finally fell into real sleep, Grace had looked up at him from where she sat on the floor beside the couch, and Dan had seen something in her face that made his breath catch. Not just kindness, something deeper, more complicated. "You're a good father," she'd said quietly, and he'd fallen, Right then, with his daughter's soft breathing between them and the hall light casting shadows on the wall. That was the night everything changed. After that, Sophie started spending more time at Grace's house, learning about flowers and birds and all the small, quiet things Grace seemed to know. And Dan started finding excuses to cross the fence line. A loose board on her porch step that he could fix. A stuck window that needed oil. Little things that gave him reasons to be near her. "Dad!" Sophie's voice pulled him back to the present. "Miss Grace says I can help her plant the new roses." "That's nice, sweetheart. Just don't get in her way." "She's never in my way," Grace called back. And when Dan looked over, she was smiling. Not at him, exactly. Somewhere past his left shoulder, the way she always did when he caught her attention. The sound of a door opening made him turn. Mrs. Patricia Hayes emerged from her house across the street, dressed like she was going to church even though it was Saturday. She surveyed the neighborhood with the expression of a woman who had opinions and intended to share them. "Early start, Daniel," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "Yes, ma'am. Old car. New problems." She adjusted her handbag. "I see young Sophie is bothering Miss Holland again." "Grace doesn't mind." "Well," Mrs. Hayes pursed her lips, "it's a lot to ask of a woman, taking on someone else's child, especially when there's no official arrangement." Dan felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Sophie likes her. Grace is kind to her. That's all there is to it." "Is it?" Mrs. Hayes tilted her head. "Because people are starting to talk, Daniel, about you spending so much time over there, about the age difference. Grace is a lovely woman, but she's what, 6 years older than you? That's not nothing. It's also not anybody's business. Everything is someone's business in a neighborhood like this." She smoothed her skirt. "I'm just saying what others are thinking. That woman deserves to be left in peace, not bothered by a younger man who doesn't understand propriety." She walked away before Dan could respond, her heels clicking on the sidewalk. He stood there, gripping the wrench hard enough to hurt, watching her disappear around the corner. When he looked back at Grace's yard, she was staring at the ground, her hands still in the dirt, but motionless. She'd heard. Of course she'd heard. Mrs. Hayes had made sure of it. The rest of the week unfolded like something inevitable and sad. Dan finished the Chevy's oil change and moved on to other projects. He mowed the lawn. He took Sophie to school and picked her up and made dinner and helped with homework. Normal things. But across the fence, Grace started staying inside more. Her garden gloves hung unused on the porch railing. Her kitchen light came on later and went off earlier. On Thursday, Dan baked cookies. He wasn't good at baking, never had been. But Sophie had mentioned that Grace liked oatmeal raisin, so he found a recipe online and gave it his best shot. They came out burnt around the edges, slightly raw in the middle, but they smelled right. He walked over to Grace's house just after sunset, the plate of cookies covered in foil. When she opened the door, her reading glasses were perched on her nose, and there was a book in her hand. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Dan, hi. I made cookies." He held out the plate. "They're not great, but Sophie said you liked oatmeal raisin." Grace took the plate slowly, like it might burn her. "That's very sweet. Thank you. Also, your window in the spare room is sticking. I noticed it last week when I was trimming the hedge. I could come by tomorrow and fix it, if you want." "Dan." She set the plate on the hall table without looking at it. "You don't need to do that." "I don't mind. Takes 5 minutes." "No, I mean," she took a breath. "You don't need to keep doing this. Bringing me things. Fixing my house. It's very kind, but it's not necessary." "What if I want to?" "That's the problem." Her voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear. "You shouldn't want to." Before he could ask what she meant, she'd stepped back and closed the door. Gentle, but final. Dan stood on her porch for a long moment, staring at the wood grain, before walking back home with empty hands. On Saturday, the farmers' market set up in the town square like it did every weekend from May to October. Sophie loved it there, the stalls of fresh vegetables and handmade crafts, and the old man who sold caramel apples from a cart. Dan had promised they'd go, and he kept his promises. He was loading Sophie into the truck when he saw Grace come out of her house wearing a light jacket and carrying a canvas shopping bag. Without thinking, he called out, "Grace, we're heading to the market. Want to come?" She froze halfway to her car. Sophie stuck her head out the truck window, grinning. "Please, Miss Grace, we can get apples and you can show me which vegetables are best." For a second, Dan thought she'd say yes. He could see it in the way her expression softened, the small smile that started at the corners of her mouth. But then she glanced past him toward Mrs. Hayes' house, and the smile died. "I can't. I have plans. But thank you." "Come on, it'll be fun," Sophie insisted. "Dad never knows what to buy, and last time he got zucchini that was all mushy." "Sophie, if Miss Grace is busy—" "Stop!" The word came out sharper than Dan had heard her speak before. Grace's hands tightened on her shopping bag. "Stop flirting with me, Dan. Please just stop." The silence that followed felt enormous. Sophie's smile disappeared. Dan stood frozen in his driveway, keys in hand, not sure what to say or do. Grace's face had gone pale. "I'm sorry. That was rude. But I need you to understand something. I'm 42 years old. You're 36. That matters." "It doesn't have to." "Yes, it does. People talk. They look at us and they see something wrong. And maybe they're right. They're not. You don't know that." Her voice cracked slightly. "You don't know what it's like to be my age and have someone younger paying attention and wondering if it's real or if it's just, I don't know, loneliness, convenience, a phase." Grace, but she was already getting into her car, backing out of the driveway without looking at him again. Dan watched her taillights disappear around the corner, then turned to find Sophie staring at him with huge, solemn eyes. "Did you make Miss Grace sad?" "I don't know, baby. Maybe. Are you going to fix it?" Dan looked at his daughter, this small, fierce person who believed he could fix anything with the right tools and enough time. "I'm going to try." They went to the farmer's market, but it wasn't the same. Sophie was quiet, picking at her caramel apple without her usual enthusiasm. When they got home, she went straight to her room instead of playing outside. Through her closed door, Dan could hear her crying, soft and restrained, the way kids cried when they were trying to be brave. He sat on the floor outside her room with his back against the wall and his head in his hands, wondering how loving someone could hurt this many people at once. The days that followed were worse than the silence before. Grace didn't just avoid him now. She actively looked away when their paths crossed, kept her curtains drawn, stopped working in her garden during hours when Sophie might be outside. It was like watching someone slowly erase themselves from his life, one careful step at a time. Dan tried to give her space. He really did. But on Tuesday morning at 5, he woke to the sound of scraping metal and looked out to see Grace struggling with her garbage cans in the pre-dawn dark. The lids had frozen on during the unexpected cold snap, and she was yanking at them with bare hands. He pulled on jeans and a jacket and crossed the fence line before he could talk himself out of it. Grace looked up when she heard his footsteps, her face a mix of frustration and something that might have been relief. "I've got it," she said. "Your hands are freezing." He took the can from her, applied leverage where it was needed, popped the lid free. Then the other two. Grace stood there watching, arms wrapped around herself. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Grace." He set down the last lid. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Pushing me away. Pushing Sophie away. We're not trying to hurt you. I know that. She wouldn't meet his eyes. That's not the point. Then what is? The words seemed to catch in her throat. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. When my husband died, I was 39 years old. We'd been married for 15 years. He was my whole world, and then one day, he just wasn't there anymore. Car accident. Some kid texting while driving ran a red light, and my entire life ended in the time it takes to send a message. Dan waited, sensing there was more. For months after, I couldn't look in mirrors, couldn't stand to see myself getting older when he'd stayed frozen at 38 forever. And when I finally did look, you know what I saw? An old woman. Someone used up and finished and done with that part of life. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I convinced myself I was okay with it, that I'd had my chance at love, and now I'd just exist, be a teacher, keep my garden, read my books. Small, safe things. Then we moved in next door. Then you moved in next door. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were wet. And your daughter is beautiful, and your smile is kind, and you fix things without being asked, and you make terrible cookies with your whole heart. And I started feeling things I promised myself I'd never feel again, and that terrifies me, Dan. Because what if this is just me being lonely? What if 6 years from now, you wake up and see what I see in the mirror? What if I'm just a placeholder until someone younger comes along? You really think that's who I am? I think you don't know yet. Neither of us does. But I'm too old to risk finding out. She went inside before he could respond, and this time when the door closed, Dan heard the deadbolt slide home. He stood in her driveway as the sun came up, understanding finally settling over him like weight. Grace wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of hope, afraid of wanting something and losing it again, afraid that loving him would end the same way loving her husband had ended, with her standing alone in an empty house, wondering why she'd been stupid enough to try. And he had no idea how to fight that kind of fear. The solution came to him 3 days later, while he was lying under a Mazda at Jake Turner's garage, replacing a transmission mount that had rusted through. Jake owned the place, had given Dan a job 5 years ago when he'd needed one badly, and seemed to think this gave him license to offer unsolicited advice about everything from carburetors to relationships. "Just tell her," Jake said from somewhere above him. "Straight up, no poetry, no games. No, women appreciate honesty." "I've been honest." "No, you've been polite. There's a difference." A pause. "You know what your problem is?" "I'm sure you'll tell me." "You're playing by her rules. She says stay away, you stay away. She says it won't work. You nod and accept it. You need to stop asking permission and start stating facts." Dan rolled out from under the car, wiping grease from his forearm. "What facts?" "That you love her. That age is bullshit. That she's scared and that's okay, but you're not going anywhere." Jake handed him a socket wrench. "Grand gestures, man. Women say they don't want them, but they do. They want to see you fight for it. This isn't a movie, Jake. No, it's better. It's real life, which means when you do something big, it actually counts." He leaned against the workbench. "Sophie's birthday is coming up, right? Week from tomorrow. There you go. Perfect opportunity. Make a speech. Tell the whole neighborhood how you feel. Put it all out there. She'll either say yes or say no, but at least you'll know." Dan looked at him. "That's the worst advice I've ever heard." "Probably. You going to take it?" He thought about Grace closing her door, about Sophie crying in her room, about waking up every morning to a house that felt emptier than it should because the woman he loved was 30 feet away and might as well be on another planet. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Sophie's birthday fell on a Saturday in late September, when the leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that particular golden quality that made everything look like a photograph. Dan had spent the week preparing, sending invitations to half the neighborhood, setting up tables in the backyard, ordering a cake from the bakery on 3rd Street. Sophie had wanted to invite Grace personally, had stood at Dan's elbow while he wrote out the invitation in his careful handwriting. "Make sure you tell her it won't be fun without her," Sophie had insisted. So he'd walked across the fence line one last time, knocked on Grace's door, and held out the envelope when she answered. "Sophie's birthday," he'd said. "Next Saturday, 2 o'clock. She really wants you there." Grace had taken the invitation but hadn't opened it. "Dan, I know. You don't think it's a good idea. You don't think we should see each other. You've made that clear." He'd stepped back, hands in his pockets. "But this isn't about us. It's about an 8-year-old girl who thinks you hung the moon. So please, just think about it." He'd walked away before she could say no. Now it was Saturday, and the backyard was full of people. Kids from Sophie's school ran around with balloons and party hats. Their parents stood in clusters, drinking lemonade and making small talk. Mrs. Hayes had come, dressed in a floral dress and a look of vague disapproval. Jake was manning the grill, flipping burgers with the confidence of a man who'd never met a social situation he couldn't dominate. And Grace's yard, visible through the fence, was empty. 2 o'clock came and went. Sophie opened presents, exclaiming over stuffed animals and art supplies, and a skateboard from Jake that was definitely not age-appropriate. She kept glancing toward the fence, hope dimming a little more each time. At 3, Dan asked Jake to watch the grill. His friend raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Dan walked to the center of the yard and cleared his throat. "Can I have everyone's attention for a minute?" The conversations died down. People turned to look at him, curious. Sophie stood next to the present table, cake frosting on her chin, watching with wide eyes. Dan's heart was hammering hard enough to hurt, but he kept his voice steady. "First, thank you all for coming to celebrate Sophie's birthday. She's pretty excited about being 8, even though I keep telling her that means she's officially too old for me to carry around anymore." A few people laughed. Sophie rolled her eyes. "But I have something else I need to say, and I'm asking you all to listen, because I've been thinking a lot lately about courage and what it means to be brave. And I've realized that the bravest thing I can do right now is tell the truth in front of all of you." Mrs. Hayes shifted her weight, and Dan saw her exchange a glance with the woman next to her. 8 months ago, Grace Holland moved in next door, and my life changed. Not because of anything dramatic or obvious, but because of small things. The way she taught Sophie about flowers, the way she stayed up half the night when my daughter had a fever, the way she looks at the world like it's still got good things in it, even though she's had every reason to stop believing that. He paused, making himself breathe. I fell in love with her, completely. The kind of love that makes you want to be better than you are. But Grace won't let me love her. She thinks she's too old for me. She thinks that 6 years is somehow more important than the fact that she makes my daughter laugh and my house feel like a home. The backyard was silent, except for the sound of wind in the trees. Some of you have opinions about this. Mrs. Hayes, I know you think it's improper. I've heard other people say things too, that we don't match, that it's weird, that I should find someone my own age. He looked around at the faces watching him, and maybe you're right. Maybe we don't make sense on paper, but I don't love her on paper. I love her in real life, where age is just a number, and what matters is how you treat people, and whether you show up when it counts. His voice roughened despite his best efforts. Grace is the kindest person I've ever met. She's brave, and she's careful, and she's been hurt so badly that she's convinced herself it's safer to be alone. And I can't fix that for her, I can't make her less afraid. But what I can do is stand here in front of all of you and say this. I love you, Grace Holland. I love the gray in your hair, and the reading glasses you wear on a chain, and the way you talk to flowers like they can hear you. I love that you're 42 and I'm 36, and none of that matters even a little bit compared to the way I feel when I'm near you. Sophie had started crying, silent tears running down her face. Jake was grinning. Mrs. Hayes looked like she'd swallowed something sour. I know some of you will judge me for this. Judge us, and that's okay. But I'm done pretending I don't feel what I feel. I'm done walking on eggshells and hoping Grace will change her mind if I just give her enough space. So here it is. Out loud, where everyone can hear it. I love her, and if she'll give me a chance, I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that age doesn't matter. Love does. He stopped talking. There was nothing else to say. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and enormous. Then Jake started clapping, slow and deliberate. A few other people joined in. Mrs. Hayes didn't clap, but she didn't leave either. And then the gate opened. Grace stood there in a simple blue dress, her reading glasses hanging from their chain, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her face was streaked with tears. In her hands, she held a wrapped present and a small bunch of flowers from her garden. Every eye in the yard turned to watch her. She walked forward like someone crossing a bridge they weren't sure would hold, her eyes locked on Dan's face. When she reached him, she set the present and flowers on the nearest table. Then she placed one hand on his cheek, her thumb brushing a smudge of grease he'd missed that morning. I heard every word, she said quietly, but in the silence of the backyard, everyone could hear. I've been standing on my porch for the last 20 minutes, trying to find the courage to walk through that gate. You found it? Barely. She took a shaky breath. I'm still scared, Dan. Scared that this is a mistake. Scared that you'll regret it. Scared that people will think I'm pathetic or desperate, or I don't care what people think. I know, but I do. I care so much it's been eating me alive. Her voice broke. But you just stood up in front of everyone we know and said you love me. You made yourself vulnerable in a way I've been too afraid to do. And that means something. It means everything. She turned to look at Sophie, who was watching with huge, hopeful eyes. Happy birthday, sweetheart. I'm sorry I almost missed it. Sophie launched herself forward, wrapping thin arms around Grace's waist. Grace held her tight, one hand smoothing down the child's hair, her eyes closed. Over Sophie's head, Grace met Dan's gaze. I love you too, she whispered. I was just too scared to say it. Dan reached out, pulling them both close. The three of them stood there in the middle of the backyard while the neighbors watched, and the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, and someone started clapping again. Then everyone was clapping, and Sophie was giggling against Grace's shoulder. Mrs. Hayes cleared her throat loudly. The yard went quiet again as she stood and walked over to them, her handbag clutched in both hands. Dan braced himself for the lecture. Instead, Mrs. Hayes looked at Grace with something that might have been respect. Well, she said crisply, I suppose if you're going to make a spectacle of yourselves, you might as well do it properly. Grace Holland, that man clearly adores you. You'd be a fool to let him go over something as meaningless as a few years. Grace blinked. Mrs. Hayes, Oh, don't look so shocked. I'm old, not heartless. She patted Sophie on the head. Happy birthday, child. Try to keep these two from doing anything too ridiculous, would you? Then she turned and walked back to her seat, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind her. Jake started laughing first. Then someone else joined in, and soon the whole backyard was filled with noise and warmth, and the sound of conversation starting up again. The party resumed around them, but Dan barely noticed. He was too busy looking at Grace, at the woman who'd been so afraid to hope, and had found her courage anyway. So, he said quietly, just for her, Does this mean you'll stop telling me to stop flirting with you? Grace smiled, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. Absolutely not. But now when I say it, I'll be lying. I can live with that. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of cake and presents and kids running wild through the backyard. Grace stayed, helping clean up after, washing dishes beside Dan in the kitchen, while Sophie fell asleep on the couch with frosting still smeared on her chin. I can't believe you did that, Grace said, scrubbing at a stubborn spot on a plate. In front of everyone. Had to. You wouldn't listen otherwise. I was listening. I've been listening this whole time. She pulled her hands from the soapy water and turned to face him. 2 nights ago, I heard Sophie crying. Her window was open and I was in my garden. She asked you why I didn't like her anymore. Grace. And you told her that I did like her, that I liked both of you, but that sometimes grown-ups were too scared of being happy to let themselves have it. Her voice shook. I lay awake all night thinking about that, about how I'd been so focused on protecting myself from getting hurt that I was guaranteeing it instead. I was hurting all 3 of us. Dan set down his dish towel and pulled her close. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist. We'll figure it out, he said into her hair. One day at a time. What if people keep talking? Then we'll let them talk. I'm done being afraid, Grace. And I think you are too. She pulled back to look up at him. Just like that? Just like that. You make it sound easy. It's not easy, but it's simple. I love you. You love me. Everything else is just noise. Grace stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and careful and full of promise. It was their first kiss, standing in his kitchen with dish soap on their hands and his daughter sleeping in the next room. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic or anything like the movies. It was perfect. The weeks that followed were an adjustment, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Grace started spending more time at their house, teaching Sophie to bake bread and helping with homework. Dan fixed things at Grace's place and actually stayed for coffee after, sitting at her kitchen table and talking until the sun went down. They went on real dates, dinner at the Italian restaurant on 5th Street, walks around the reservoir, a terrible action movie that Sophie picked and they both pretended to enjoy. The neighborhood adjusted too. Hayes stopped making pointed comments and started inviting Grace to her book club. Other neighbors smiled when they saw Dan and Grace together, some genuinely warm, others a bit forced, but trying. And the few who still whispered gradually learned that nobody cared what they thought. Sophie bloomed. She had her father and Grace, who was becoming something like a second mother, even if they didn't use that word yet. She had stability and laughter, and the kind of home that felt safe all the way down. One evening in early November, Dan came home from work to find Grace and Sophie sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by art supplies. Sophie had paint on her nose and a huge grin on her face. "Look, Dad!" She held up a piece of victoire. Picked up a piece of poster board covered in careful drawings. 3 stick figures held hands in front of a house, flowers blooming all around them. "It's us!" Dan leaned over her shoulder, studying the picture. Sophie had drawn herself in the middle, him on one side, Grace on the other, all of them smiling. "It's beautiful, baby. I'm giving it to Miss Grace, so she can put it in her house and remember that we're a family now." Grace's eyes went bright with tears. She pulled Sophie into a hug, pressing a kiss to the top of the child's head. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll hang it in my kitchen where I can see it every day." Later, after Sophie was in bed and Grace was getting ready to go back to her own house, Dan stopped her at the door. "Stay," he said. "Dan, not like that. Just stay, read on the couch, fall asleep in the chair. I just want you here." Grace studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." They settled on the couch together, Grace with a book, and Dan with paperwork from the garage that he wasn't really reading. The house was quiet in the way that meant peace, not loneliness. Sophie's soft breathing drifted from upstairs. At some point, Grace's book slipped from her hands, and she dozed off against his shoulder. Dan set aside his papers and let himself drift, thinking about how 5 years ago he'd stood in this same house, feeling like his world had ended. And now here he was with a woman who'd taught him that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to let them. 6 months after Sophie's birthday party, Dan found himself back in his driveway on a Saturday morning, working on the same old Chevy that had been giving him trouble since the beginning. But this time, when he looked up, Grace wasn't watching from her kitchen window. She was kneeling beside him, handing him tools and asking questions about engines that she didn't really care about, but asked anyway, because that's what you did when you loved someone. Sophie was in Grace's garden, planting bulbs that wouldn't bloom until spring. The three of them had formed their own small world, learning each other's rhythms and needs. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, interrupting his thoughts. Dan looked at her, at the dirt on her knees, and the reading glasses perched on her nose, and the silver threads in her hair that caught the afternoon light. "Just that I'm glad you ignored me when I told you to stop flirting with me." She laughed. "You never told me to stop. I told you to stop." "Right. And I'm glad I ignored you." "Me too." She handed him a wrench. "Are you going to tell me what's in that box you keep looking at in your sock drawer?" Dan nearly dropped the wrench. "How did you—" "I was putting away laundry last week. I didn't open it, but I saw it." She tilted her head. "Is it what I think it is?" He set down the wrench and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Maybe. I've been waiting for the right time." "And when's that?" "When I'm sure you won't run." Grace took his greasy hand in hers. "I'm not running anymore, Dan. I promise." That evening, after dinner and dishes and getting Sophie ready for bed, Dan found Grace sitting on her own porch, looking through a photo album. He sat beside her without asking, and she leaned into him automatically now, comfortable with the weight of him. The album was old, the pages yellowing at the edges, pictures of Grace younger, laughing next to a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her late husband. There were wedding photos, vacation snapshots, quiet moments caught on film. "I used to look at these and feel like I was betraying him," Grace said quietly. "By wanting to move on, by loving you. And now? Now I think he'd be happy for me. He always said I deserved good things." She turned the page, and there was a newer photo tucked in among the old ones. Dan and Grace and Sophie at the reservoir. Jake had taken it without them noticing. All three of them laughing at something Sophie had said. "I wanted them together," Grace explained. "My past and my present. So I could remember that both are real. Both matter." Dan kissed the top of her head, not trusting his voice. The next morning, he woke to find Sophie sitting at the kitchen table, bent over a notebook with fierce concentration. When he looked over her shoulder, he saw neat handwriting at the top of the page. "My Family," by Sophie Morrison. "School assignment?" he asked. "Yeah, we have to write about our family." She looked up at him. "Can I write about Miss Grace too, even though she doesn't live here?" "Of course you can, baby." "Good. Because she's part of our family now, right?" "Right." Sophie went back to her writing, and Dan made coffee, thinking about families and how they weren't always what you expected. Sometimes, they were just three people who'd found each other across a fence line and decided to be brave enough to stay. Late that afternoon, as the sun started to sink toward the horizon, Dan found all three of them in Grace's backyard. The rose bushes Grace had planted in spring were in full bloom now, deep red and pink and yellow. Sophie was running around with a butterfly net, chasing monarchs with the single-minded determination of childhood. Dan sat on the porch swing, and Grace settled beside him, fitting into the curve of his arm like she'd always belonged there. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie called out, abandoning the butterflies to climb onto the swing between them. "Always," Grace said. "Are you going to marry my dad?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Dan felt Grace go still beside him, but when he looked down, she was smiling. "That's up to your dad, sweetheart." Sophie turned to Dan with an expression of utter seriousness. "Well, are you?" Dan laughed despite himself. "Maybe someday, if Miss Grace will have me." "She will," Sophie said with complete confidence. "She loves us." "I do," Grace agreed softly. "Very much." "Then why wait?" Sophie slid off the swing. "Grown-ups are weird. You love each other, so get married. It's not complicated." She ran back to her butterflies, leaving Dan and Grace alone on the swing, gently rocking in the fading light. "She's not wrong," Dan said. "No, but she's 8. She doesn't understand that some things take time. We've had time, 8 months of it. Is that enough?" Dan pulled the small box from his pocket, the one he'd been carrying for 2 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt right. This moment, with Sophie chasing butterflies and the roses blooming and Grace warm against his side, felt perfect. "I don't know if it's enough," he said, "but I know I don't want to wait anymore. I know I wake up every morning thinking about you. I know Sophie draws pictures with 3 people in them now instead of 2. I know that you've taken my life and made it bigger and brighter and more than I ever thought it could be." He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, a single stone on a silver band, nothing fancy or elaborate. Grace drew in a sharp breath. "I love you, Grace Holland. Not despite your age, not because of it, but completely separate from it. I love you because you're kind and brave, and you make terrible coffee, and you taught my daughter that the world is still worth believing in." He took her left hand in his. "Will you marry me?" Grace looked at the ring, then at Sophie, still chasing butterflies, then back at Dan. Tears were running down her face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she kissed him there on the porch swing, while the sun set and the roses bloomed, and Sophie cheered in the background, having apparently been paying more attention than they'd thought. That night, the 3 of them sat on that same swing, Sophie between them, all of them squeezed together in the fading light. Sophie peppered them with questions about the wedding, already planning her dress and the flowers, and whether she could have a puppy as a ring-bearer. Dan listened to his daughter's chatter and felt Grace's hand in his, the ring cool against her skin, and thought about how far they'd all come, from those first careful days of watching each other across the fence line, to Sophie's birthday party, and the speech that had changed everything, to this moment where they were planning a future together. "Hey," Sophie said suddenly, looking up at Grace. "Does this mean you won't tell Dad to stop flirting with you anymore?" Grace laughed, the sound bright and free. "Oh, I'll still tell him that. Old habits die hard. But you don't mean it, right? Not even a little bit." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and snuggled back between them. They sat there as the stars came out, 3 people who'd all been broken in different ways and had somehow found wholeness together. "Stop flirting with me," that's what Grace had said, 3 times, each time with a voice that trembled just enough to betray the truth. She hadn't wanted him to stop. She'd been afraid to want him to continue. But fear, Dan had learned, was just love that hadn't found its courage yet. And they'd found it. All three of them. In a backyard in Portland, Oregon, surrounded by roses and butterflies, and the kind of ordinary magic that happens when people choose to be brave enough to love despite the odds. The world would keep spinning. People would keep having opinions about age gaps and appropriate relationships and what a family should look like. But here on this porch swing, with his daughter on one side and his future wife on the other, Dan Morrison had everything he needed. And it was enough. More than enough. It was perfect.